There will be no shouting here, no sudden noises to startle the listener. In this vast, eternal city, there is already far too much clamor, too much hurried life. If the listener is willing to simply close their eyes and attend, the story of the sand will unfold. That particular kind of arena sand, the arena, which has absorbed more human sorrow and blood than all the imperial campaigns combined. It is not a story that invokes pride, but it is one that demands understanding. Man, Roman man especially, craves bread, and he craves for his soul to be seized by both terror and elation simultaneously. Whenever one passes near the vast stone bowls, the Colosseum, the amphitheatres of Capua, or Verona, particular scent lingers, not the expected aromas of street food or the city's drainage, but the sharp, mineral tang of iron, overlaid with the deep, cold smell of dread. This quiet dread, and the lives that exuded it, will be the subject of this long, deliberate recounting. Forget the heroic tales painted on frescoes and the exaggerations of the poets. The truth lies in the grime, in the taste of cheap barley, and the relentless, grinding presence of pain. This is the chronicle of those who sold their short futures for the theatrical spectacle of their own demise. Sound, the indistinct shouts of a crowded slave market, the shuffling of many feet, perhaps the clank of chains, in the sprawling markets of Rome, of the staging camps near the frontiers, one could observe the new arrivals. They were the war captives, Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Dacians. Their eyes were often vacant, still reflecting the shock of battle and the chains. They possessed the terrible good fortune of survival only to become a commodity. They did not yet grasp that their existence had been reduced to a potential performance. The Roman master had little sentimentality for a typical slave, but even less for one designated for the arena. A field slave was an investment in production. A gladiator was an investment in spectacle. His value was high, and his risk was higher, but his potential for generating political goodwill and sheer coin was enormous. The custom, the munus, had begun centuries before as a solemn debt paid to the dead, a funeral rite where bloodshed was thought to appease the departed spirits. But that sacred duty quickly devolved. Politicians discovered that the roar of the crowd was louder than the whisper of conscience. The ludi grew grander, the bloodshed more profuse, and the public demanded ever more complex and exotic victims. The transformation from spiritual offering to crass commerce marked the beginning of the gladiator's tragedy. The key figure in this transaction was the lanista. The name itself, derived perhaps from the Etruscan word for butcher, was spoken with societal contempt, yet enormous power. The lanista was the impresario of death, the producer of the show. He scouted the strong, the desperate, the uniquely built, paying hefty sums to the slave traders or the legions. He viewed a potential fighter purely in terms of physical mechanics and crowd appeal, examining limbs, teeth, and musculature as one would assess livestock. He might ask the captive's name, only to dismiss it instantly. The old identity held no currency. Only the new, designated role mattered within the confines of the ludus. Alongside the captives, an even more peculiar and tragic group presented themselves, the octoroti. These were men who possessed full Roman citizenship, sometimes even a degree of education or family lineage. They came forward willingly, driven by overwhelming detes alienum, social disgrace, or perhaps a strange, burning desire for fame that was unavailable to them in the staid public life of the citizen. Signing the contract with the lanista was the ultimate act of self-negation. By this signature, a free man sold not just his labor, but his very right to life, committing to a fixed term of combat. This step was the formal acceptance of the gladiator's infamous status, the infamia. He was relegated to a legal and social standing below that of a common criminal, stripped of the rights of a citizen, the ability to vote, to stand for office, to even testify in a proper court. Upon entering the service, all men, slave and free citizen alike, had to pronounce the terrifying gladiator's vow, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium. It was a quiet, binding promise, uri, vincere, verberare, farec necari. I shall permit myself to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. The man consciously surrendered his humanity, becoming a living piece of chattel, an object subject to destruction on demand. This was not the entry into a life. It was the formal branding for a designated death. His journey to the ludus was a descent into a specialized form of social purgatory. Behind the high, foreboding gates of the training school, the fighter lost all sight of the civilian world. He was now bona mobilia, movable property, an asset requiring careful, expensive management and constant physical repair, all for the fleeting, bloody spectacle that awaited him on the sand. The immense profit generated by his performance, contrasted with the utter destitution of his social standing, defined the deep, unresolvable paradox of his existence. The ludus, it is not merely a military barracks, nor is it strictly a prison designed for correction. It is a specialized form of human husbandry, a cold, monolithic structure designed for the single, terrifying purpose of transforming men into marketable weapons. The stone walls, perpetually damp and thick, prevent any proper observation of the civilian world outside. Here, the air itself carries a unique and pervasive scent, the sharp, metallic tang of unhealed wounds, the sour aroma of stale sweat, and, always, the heavy, monotonous odor of boiled barley and cheap vinegar. It is a smell that settles deep into the clothes and the soul. Though structures like the massive Ludus Magnus stood proudly near the great Colosseum, visible to all of Rome, the world within was one of forced blindness. The man, the new recruit, the tyro, entered a space where the sky was only a thin, distant ribbon visible from the central courtyard. His first lesson was the erasure of self. He was no longer Publius, or Vercingetorix, or Spartacus. He was chattel, a statistical unit of muscle. The overseer of this gruesome factory was not the lanista, who remained the distant financier. It was the doctor, the trainer. The term is ironic, for this man was less a healer and more a brutal sculptor. The doctor's job was to assess the man's inherent nature, his ethnic origin, his physical build, his fighting temperament, and assign him a specific, theatrical persona. The doctor did not seek to improve the man's natural fighting style. He sought to channel it into one of the established armature fighting types. If the recruit was slender and quick, he might become a retiarius, reliant on the net and the trident. If he was stoic and heavily muscled, he was destined to become a murmillo, a figure of brute, armored force. This process of assignment was critical to the spectacle. The gladiator's equipment, from the crest on his helmet to the shape of his shield, was a carefully designed costume intended to create a visual and combat aesthete. The armaturae were designed to oppose each other perfectly, the heavily protected, slow secutor fighting the lightly armored, agile retiarius. The contrast guaranteed a tense, prolonged struggle, not a quick, efficient death. The primary tool of instruction was the palace, the 6-foot-tall wooden post set deeply into the ground. Day after monotonous day, the recruits were drilled against this immovable object with heavy wooden swords, rudis, and wicker shields. This practice was relentless, focused not on striking down an opponent, but on precision, form, and endurance. The blow must be delivered with flair, the parry must be graceful. The fundamental reality of the ludus was that the trainee was being prepared, not for war, but for a performance of war. He must learn to execute a fatal strike with dramatic economy. The doctor and his assistants ensured that discipline was absolute, often enforced by the very sight of the chains and the omnipresent stinging flagrum whip. A man who failed to perform, who showed lethargy, or who dared to resist the regimen, was severely punished. The stakes were immediate and tangible. A broken body was an unproductive body, and an unproductive body was swiftly disposed of outside the arena's theatrical drama. The economic imperative overruled all others. The psychological dimension of the training was as cruel as the physical. The gladiator was stripped of all privacy. He slept in a communal barrack, chained to his comrades at night. He ate under constant supervision. There was no space for reflection, no moment for quiet remembrance of the life that was lost. The unrelenting routine, the same gruel, the same drills, the same stench of fear was designed to erode personal identity until all that remained was the reflexes of the professional fighter. Yet, there was an unintended consequence to this enforced proximity and shared suffering. In the silent, suffocating hours between drills, a strange and powerful brotherhood began to forge itself. The common notion held by the civilian that the gladiator gorged himself on great cuts of meat, building mountains of muscle, was a fanciful lie. The truth was far more meager, smelling of the earth and boiling water. The fighters were known as the barley eaters or harderi. Their diet was rigidly simple, monotonous, and designed not for flavor but for function, primarily thick barley gruel, lentils, beans, and dried fruits. This was the fuel that sustained the empire's greatest athletes of death. The composition of this bland, starchy diet served a profound and tragically practical purpose. It was overwhelmingly rich in carbohydrates, leading the gladiators to be not lean and sculpted, but rather dense and well-padded. This layer of subcutaneous fat acted as a natural shield. When a swift, sharp gladiatorial blade designed to draw blood dramatically struck the body, the fat often prevented the cut from penetrating deep enough to sever major arteries or damage vital organs immediately. The wound bled profusely, satisfying the crowd's thirst for visible carnage, yet often spared the fighter a quick, anticlimactic death. The spectacle was maximized, the asset preserved. Furthermore, a peculiar ingredient was mixed into their routine, a foul-tasting, dark drink made from vinegar and plantash. This was not some ancient delicacy. Historical research, confirmed by modern analysis of gladiator remains, suggests this drink provided a massive calcium boost. It was a crude, empirical attempt to ensure their bones were exceptionally thick and dense, capable of withstanding the blunt trauma and crushing impacts that were common even in supervised sparring. The body, therefore, was treated less as human flesh and more as a highly specialized, self-repairing machine. The Lannister's investment in these men was substantial, meaning the quality of their medical care was paradoxically excellent. When a fighter was wounded and every serious bout guaranteed wounds, he was returned to the Ludus, not to die, but to be meticulously repaired. The doctors of the gladiatorial schools were, by necessity, among the most skilled surgeons in the Roman world, their expertise honed by the constant need to mend devastating fractures, stitch gaping flesh, and manage crippling infections. The archaeological evidence, specifically the examination of burial sites, reveals countless examples of complex, successfully healed injuries, perfectly set broken femurs, patched skull fractures, and meticulously tended cuts. This level of care was devoid of any sentimentality. It was purely an economic decision. A valuable asset must be brought back to fighting form, regardless of the pain or the lengthy recovery time. The gladiator's existence was a recurring cycle of agonizing injury, followed by advanced, painful convalescence, only to return to the sand. His body was his prison, and the sophisticated medicine of the empire merely served to keep the bars intact. Every morning, the gladiator woke to the nagging ache of a dozen scars, each one a grim receipt for a performance already rendered, and a brutal prediction of the one soon to come. He lived, not through mercy, but because his potential for future entertainment outweighed the cost of his immediate death. The tragedy was not that they died so violently, but that they were kept alive so skillfully, only to repeat the agonizing process. The atmosphere within the damp, sun-starved confines of the Ludus fostered an agonizing paradox. A man was utterly alone in his fate, stripped of his name, his past, and his civil rights, yet he was never actually alone. He was surrounded by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men who were tomorrow's potential killers or tomorrow's necessary sacrifices. This enforced proximity, this constant presence of doom, ironically gave rise to the only semblance of community left to the gladiator, the brotherhood of the condemned. They were the collegium, a grim fraternity bound not by shared nationhood or language, but by the universal language of the sacramentum, the vow of death. The men hailed from the edges of the empire and beyond, the towering, fair-haired German, the wiry, fierce Thracian, the subtle, philosophical Greek, and even the unfortunate Roman debtor, the Octoratus. In the barracks, where they slept chained to the wall or to each other in tight rows, the air was thick with whispered exchanges, in a babble of tongues, all filtered through the necessity of survival. They shared the same watery barley gruel, the same stale scent of linen, and the same quiet knowledge that every dawn brought them closer to the arena. No free citizen, no magistrate, no distant wife or father could ever truly comprehend the unique terror and humiliation these men faced. Only the men beside them, the ones whose breath they smelled and whose quiet moans they heard after a brutal session with the doctor, understood. This mutual awareness, this tacit acceptance of shared, inescapable suffering became a fragile pillar of sanity. They supported one another not out of affection, but out of professional respect and the need for communal endurance. They might help a comrade mend a broken practice shield, offer a small, extra measure of water, or simply provide silent company during the long, suffocating hours before sleep. This bond was strongest during the evenings preceding a major bout. The silence in the barracks would become heavy, almost pressurized, a palpable counterpoint to the distant, muffled celebrations already beginning in the city. Some men would occupy themselves with meticulous, hypnotic routine, sharpening the blade of the seeker, testing the netting of the reti, or meticulously oiling the leather strips of the manica arm guard. Other, more literate fighters might laboriously scratch a final, formal farewell onto a wax tablet, knowing this would be the final contact with the world they had lost. Others simply stared at the wall, their minds already detached from their bodies, seeking that deep, icy calm necessary for the performance. They did not speak of life. They spoke only of the manner of death, of standing tall, of landing the blow correctly, of ensuring they did not dishonor their armatura or their comrades by showing cowardice. The gladiators' true focus, the ultimate prize in their dark world, was not victory that was merely an extension of service. The true prize was dignitas, dignity. They were deprived of every other form of honor, yet they clung ferociously to the right to die well. The Roman audience, for all its bloodlust, demanded courage and fortitude in the face of annihilation. A quick, whimpering death was a disgrace to the craft and to the collegium. A dignified, stoic acceptance of the final blow that commanded respect, even applause, and sometimes pity. But the Brotherhood's limits were brutal and absolute. The moment they stepped out from the cool darkness of the Ludus tunnels into the blinding light and deafening roar of the amphitheater, the bomb dissolved. They were no longer fellow sufferers. They were specific, designated enemies in a choreographed dance of mortality. They fought not from personal hatred, but from professional necessity. They were obligated to provide the crowd with the violent spectacle it had paid for, even if that meant delivering the fatal blow to the man who had shared his barley gruel the night before. This transition from comrade to killer in a matter of footsteps was, perhaps, the most profound and subtle tragedy woven into the fabric of the gladiatoress existence. The evening before the Ludi, the main spectacle, was marked by the most profound piece of theatrical cruelty the Romans had devised, a ceremony known by the bitterly ironic name of the Coin Olibra, or the Free Supper. This was not a moment of quiet reflection for the condemned. It was the final, grotesque staging of the gladiator's life, a public exhibition designed to heighten the crowd's anticipation and maximize the fighter's humiliation. The Lanista, never missing an opportunity to parade his expensive assets, would orchestrate this feast in a public place, often a major bathhouse, a large hall, or even a section of the city forum. The fighters were washed, oiled, and dressed in their finest civilian attire, the garments designed to underscore the temporary and utterly false return to a civil status they no longer possessed. They were laid out on couches, or triclinia, at richly provisioned tables, afforded the best food, and wine the city could offer, a stunning contrast to the thin barley gruel that had defined their existence in the Ludus, and the public came in droves. Patricians and plebeians, senators and their wives, merchants and common artisans, they all flocked to the Coena Libera. They came not to offer comfort or to mourn. They came to stare, to inspect the bodies that would soon be butchered for their pleasure. They treated the event as a macabre viewing of livestock before the slaughter. The atmosphere was thick with a disturbing blend of festive revelry and prurient curiosity. Wealthy women, who often harbored intense, illicit fascination with the gladiators, would openly gaze at the men, assessing their physique, their demeanor, and their potential for courage or despair the following day. The psychological weight of this event was immense. For the gladiator, the experience was profoundly destabilizing. After months or years of enforced isolation, silence, and anonymity within the Ludus, he was suddenly thrust into the dazzling, overwhelming chaos of high society. The men were free to eat, to drink, to speak, to entertain guests who had purchased the privilege of conversation. Yet, every word spoken, every morsel of food consumed, was observed and judged. There was no true freedom here. The men were merely performing the role of human being one last time, before transforming into the specialized instruments of death. One could witness the entire spectrum of human reaction around those tables. Some gladiators, perhaps the younger, newer recruits, sat frozen, unable to touch the expensive food, their eyes darting around the room, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people gazing at their faces, memorizing the features they would soon see contorted in pain. Others, the veterans, the successful men who had earned the rudies and been forced back, affected a demeanor of studied arrogance and nonchalant dismissal. They drank deeply of the wine, spoke loudly, even flirted with the women, desperate to reclaim some fragments of the dignity Rome had stolen, clinging to the performative bravado that was their only remaining defense. The food itself carried a silent cruelty: rich roasted meats, succulent fruits, delicate pastries, items designed to tempt and remind the men precisely what they were about to lose. The sensory details were sharp: the intense fragrance of spiced wine, the smooth texture of polished marble beneath their fingers, the soft, expensive wool of the citizens' togas brushing past their temporary couches. These were textures and tastes that would be replaced within hours by the gritty, metallic taste of dust and blood. For those few gladiators who had family or patrons in the city, the Coena Libera offered a final, excruciating opportunity for contact. A wife might be permitted a brief, tearful goodbye. A relative might slip a small coin or amulet into the fighter's hand. These moments were watched by the crowd with detached fascination, adding a small, humanizing, and ultimately tragic layer to the spectacle. The man was reminded of what love felt like, what normal connection meant, just hours before he was asked to discard all humanity and fight for his survival. It was during this night that the final letters were written, notes dictated to a literate slave or scratched onto wax tablets by the few gladiators who could write. They were simple, formal farewells, instructions regarding small properties or debts, a bleak acknowledgement that tomorrow, the man who wrote these words would likely be nothing but ash and bone. The entire event was a masterful psychological preparation for death. It briefly resurrected the citizen, only to kill him again, more completely, in the morning. The Lanista would patrol the hall, calculating his potential losses, estimating the payout for each man, and observing their behavior. He needed the fighters to be relaxed, even slightly drunk, but not so much that it impaired their fighting ability. He was a shepherd leading his expensive, prize-winning sheep to the altar, ensuring they were well fed and composed for the sacrifice. As the night wore on, the festive sounds outside would soften, the crowds would thin, and the gladiators would be led back to the chill quiet of the Ludus, carrying with them the scent of wine and the crushing knowledge of the dawn. Morning, the air in Rome is sharp, filled with the smell of wood smoke, cheap incense, and a palpable wave of anticipation that washes over the city. Today is the day of the games, the Ludi, the entire social structure of the empire pauses. All roads, all thoughts, lead to the colossal stone structure of the amphitheater. The city is gripped by a fever known only to those preparing for a mass spectacle. It is a riot of noise and motion, the very antithesis of the cold, rigid silence of the ludus. The gladiators are awakened before dawn. There is no ceremony, only the necessary preparation. They are stripped of their civilian clothes, given their fighting gear, not the heavy, specialized armor they will use in the main events, but bright, clean linen tunics, often dyed crimson or purple for visual effect. This is the uniform for the parade, the prelude to the bloody drama. Their weapons are polished. Their helmets with their elaborate crests and visors are carried by assistants. The first act of the day is the pompa, the procession. This is the grand, ceremonial entry, the parade of death itself. The gladiators emerge from the shadowed, oppressive gate of the ludus and step into the brilliant Roman sunlight and the deafening roar of the crowd. They are immediately immersed in a chorus of adoration, excitement, and vulgarity. For these few minutes, walking the city streets toward the arena, the gladiator is the biggest celebrity in the Roman world, a paradox of glory heaped upon utter social degradation. The procession is meticulously organized. It begins with the officials, the sponsors, editors, and the priests, followed by musicians whose cymbals, horns, cornua, and flutes attempt to subdue the chaos. Then come the objects of the show, massive cages holding the exotic beasts for the morning hunt venatio, carts loaded with the ornate weapons and armor, and finally, the gladiators themselves. They walk slowly, deliberately, maintaining a military pace that contrasts sharply with the frantic energy around them. Their faces, usually grim and set in the barracks, are now required to display a certain stoicism and pride. They are the embodiment of Roman virtue's manly virtue, even as they are simultaneously its lowest legal category, the infames. The crowd presses in, reaching out to touch their limbs, shouting their chosen nicknames, the Thracian's eye, or the Gaul's strength. A brief, burning flash of recognition before the anonymity of death. It is upon entering the great archways of the arena that the most famous, and perhaps most apocryphal, moment occurs. As the procession files past the sponsor's box, often occupied by the emperor himself, the fighters are said to have uttered the chilling salutation, Avenu, Imperator, Morituri te salutant, Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. While historical evidence suggests this phrase may have been reserved for only one particular naval spectacle, it perfectly encapsulates the deep, theatrical tragedy of the moment. It is not a plea for mercy. It is a formal, ritualized acknowledgement of power, the final, absolute surrender of the individual will to the authority of the state and the passion of the mob. The sensation of entering the arena proper is overwhelming. After the claustrophobia of the ludus, the vast openness of the amphitheater is a sensory assault. The glare of the sun on the freshly raked arena, the sheer blinding multitude of white togas rising tire upon tire, the concentrated, high-pitched screaming of perhaps 50,000 or more voices, it is total submersion. The gladiator has completed the journey from freeman to property, from private fear to public spectacle. His identity is complete. He is now a living prop on the stage of empire. And the long, terrible day is only just beginning. With the grand pompa complete, the day of spectacles, the ludi officially commenced. It was a marathon of violence, meticulously scheduled to maximize audience attendance and emotional engagement, proceeding in three distinct, escalating phases. The morning was reserved for the venatio, the hunt, a stunning and terrifying demonstration of imperial reach and wealth. The Roman world was convinced of its own supremacy over nature, and the venatio was the physical proof. Cages were hauled up from the subterranean passages, the hypogeum releasing thousands of exotic animals, gathered from the far-flung corners of the empire. Lions from Africa, bears from Caledonia, panthers, from Asia Minor, rhinoceroses, elephants, and even the rare enormous crocodiles. This was less a natural hunt and more a staged ecological massacre, a visceral reminder to the Roman populace that their borders commanded the savage wilds of the world. The fighters in this morning spectacle were the Venatores hunters and bestiarii beast fighters. These were not strictly gladiators, they were trained specialists. The Venatores were often professional hunters, skilled in light armor, using spears, bows, and whips to dispatch the beasts with a certain calculated flair. Their goal was to showcase agility and precision, avoiding the heavy, slow engagement typical of gladiator duels. The spectacle was breathtakingly expensive, often consuming entire local populations of endangered species. A massive, ongoing drain on the empire's coffers, justified entirely by political showmanship. The crowd loved the sheer volume and ferocity, roaring as lions were speared, or as massive bears lumbered onto the sand, confused and terrifying. As the sun climbed to its zenith, marking the midday hour, the nature of the games underwent a profound and chilling shift. This was the time of the meridiani, the midday executions. This hour was considered the lunch break for the typical Roman spectator, a necessary interval before the main event. Yet, for those sentenced, it was the most barbaric exhibition of imperial justice. The midday session was reserved for those deemed utterly expendable by the state, murderers, deserters, criminals, and slaves who had committed heinous crimes. These victims were known as the noxi, the guilty. Unlike the professional gladiators, they were not trained, nor were they given specialized, protective armatura. They were thrown into the arena with minimal or no protection, often tied to stakes, dressed in bizarre, insulting costumes, or handed blunt weapons, and forced to face fully armed executioners or, more commonly, ravenous, starved beasts. The term for being executed by animals, damnatio ad bestias, was a common sentence. But the true horror lay with the grotesque theatricality. The executions were often dramatized, turning brutal murder into classical mythology. A criminal might be tied to a wheel to be torn apart, playing the role of Ixion. Another might be forced to fight an animal with a wooden sword, playing the part of Hercules, only to meet a far less heroic end. These were not duels of skill. They were spectacles of absolute power and intentional, personalized terror. For the Roman citizens watching, these executions provided a stark legal lesson. This is the price of challenging the Pax Romana. The speed and casual cruelty of the midday slaughter were in sharp contrast to the regulated professionalism of the gladiator bouts. Spectators sometimes complained about the monotony and senselessness of the midday bloodshed, preferring the skill-based violence. The phrase went that they were sent out to be killed by the sword or consumed by the fire, serving as a stark, bloody punctuation mark between the thrilling beast hunts and the main event to come. The professional gladiators resting in the cool dark tunnels beneath the stands could hear the chaotic desperate sounds of the midday session, the frantic screams of the condemned, the uncontrolled roar of the hungry animals, and the ugly disorganized clamor of a crowd watching unstructured death. This auditory barrage was their final psychological preparation, a grim reminder of what happens when the rules of combat and the protection of the armatura are removed. They knew they were performers of calculated, stylized death, while the unfortunates above were simply raw material for casual destruction. The difference, though slim, was everything. It was the boundary between the tragic and the utterly disposable. The sun has passed its zenith, the sand has been raked clean of the chaotic remnants of the morning's hunts and the midday's casual butchery. The primary performance has arrived. The gladiators, having waited in the cool, echoing darkness of the hypogeum for hours, now emerge, entering the blinding, colossal amphitheater. This is the core tragedy, the reason the city is paralyzed, the carefully orchestrated, rule-bound duels between specialists. This is not the disorderly brawl of a battlefield. It is a highly formalized, professional, and rigidly defined piece of theater. The pairs are not random. They are meticulously matched to ensure maximum dramatic tension through contrast. The heavy, slow Murmillo, recognizable by his great crested helmet and large oblong shield scutum, is almost always paired against the quick, serpentine Threx, who wields a small, round shield palmer, and the infamous curved short sword Seeker, the Retiarius, relying on a vast, weighted net reti, a trident tridents, and utter agility, faces the Secutor, who is designed with a smooth, fish-shaped helmet to foil the net and a heavy sword to force close combat. The fights were bound by the strict laws of the Lex Gladiatoria, overseen by the Summa Rudis, a highly experienced referee, often a retired gladiator himself. His job was to ensure the integrity of the show, not the safety of the fighters. He would use a long staff to physically separate the men if the fighting became too dull or too disorganized, enforcing the pacing that the crowd demanded. The gladiators' training, all those endless hours spent hammering the palace, was focused on these specific, theatrical exchanges. Every thrust, every parry, every move was designed not primarily for efficiency, but for visual impact. The fight commences with a flurry of regulated aggression. The crowd demands action, but the fighters are cautious. They circle, testing their opponent's rhythm, searching for the opening that allows for a dramatic, non-fatal wound. The aim is calculated injury, a deep, superficial gash on a limb that bleeds profusely, but does not immediately kill in a perfect strike. It satisfies the crowd's thirst for blood while keeping the duel alive. The blood, splashing darkly against the yellow arena, is the very lifeblood of the spectacle. Consider the desperate ballet between the Retiarius and the Secutor. The Retiarius, essentially a fisherman fighting a walking tank, must remain in perpetual motion, flicking the heavy net to entangle the Secutor's sword arm or trip his heavy legs. The Secutor, blinded by his helmet, save for two small eye holes, relies entirely on aggressive forward momentum, trying to close the distance and bypass the trident's reach. If the Retiarius loses his net, he is left with only a dagger and his speed, a truly terrifying position. The crowd screams, invested in the drama of technology versus agility, heavy armor versus sheer bravado. The duration of the duel is crucial. The spectators abhor a quick kill, but equally, they despise a stalemate. The tension builds in direct proportion to the physical exhaustion of the fighters. Sweat streams, mixed with grime and blood, darkening the sand around their feet. Their breath becomes ragged, audible even over the collective roar of the tens of thousands. The exhaustion is part of the drama. It demonstrates the immense effort and willingness to suffer for the audience's pleasure. A fight that lasted 15 minutes was a success. A fight that lasted less than 2 was a waste of resources and a disappointment. The climax arrives when one of the combatants is clearly and irreversibly disabled, a crippling wound to the knee, a broken arm, or simply a collapse from sheer exhaustion. The fighter, recognizing the end, drops his shield and weapon, raising his index finger to signal submission and plea for mercy. The impetrori. The noise of the arena abruptly ceases. It is a silence more terrifying than the previous roar. Every eye, tens of thousands strong, fixes on the standing victor, the wounded supplicant on the ground, and finally, upon the sponsor of the games, the editor or the emperor high in the Polvina imperial box. The fate of the fallen man, who minutes earlier was a fierce warrior, now rests entirely on a moment of political whim and popular appeal. He has given his performance. Now, he must await the final, absolute judgment of the crowd he served. The drama of the duel is over, replaced by the cold, political ritual of death or reprieve. The contest, the dynamic, life or death drama, has ceased. What follows is the ritual of judgment, a moment of political theatre far colder and more profound than the battle itself. The entire colossal structure, perhaps holding 60,000 souls, falls into a terrifying silence. All eyes, now stripped of the frenzy of watching the duel, turn upward, focusing on the powerful figures seated in the Polvina the imperial box, or the seat of the game sponsor, the editor. The fate of the supplicant, the fallen warrior who had dropped his shield and raised a pleading finger in the gesture of impetrori, now rested on their political whim and the caprice of the mob. The victor stands over his exhausted and defeated opponent, his own lungs burning, his weapon poised. He is both the executioner and the advocate, as his stance and his willingness to delay the final blow often influence the decision. He must remain alert, ready to deliver the death stroke instantly should the verdict command it. The sponsor, typically a consul, a magistrate, or the emperor himself, delays the decision, allowing the tension to cool tighter. The crowd, the Roman populace, is suddenly given a voice. Their opinion, their favor or disgust is crucial. They begin to chant, a low, guttural wave of collective will. If the fallen fighter had acquitted himself bravely, if he had shown virtues, manly courage even in defeat, the crowd might yell mit. Send him away, signaling their desire for mercy and reprieve. This was an expensive choice for the editor, who often had to pay the lanista a fee missio for sparing the valuable assets. However, if the fighter had been cowardly, fought without spirit, or if the crowd was simply hungry for a sacrifice, the chanting would switch to a demanding, unified roar, Ugula. Cut his throat. This decision was often accompanied by a specific, chilling hand signal, the pollis verso, the turned thumb. It is essential to understand that the iconic image of the thumb down is likely a profound misinterpretation. Historical texts and archaeological evidence suggest the gesture for death was not necessarily the thumb pointed down, but rather the thumb pointed inward towards the breast or throat, symbolizing a sword being plunged into the body or drawn from the scabbard. Conversely, the gesture for a mercy mitt was likely the thumb held closed, or perhaps pointed upward, indicating the sword should be returned to its sheath. Regardless of the exact direction, the gesture was immediate, visual, and binding, transmitting the final, fatal judgment across the vast arena. The sponsor weighs the cost and the politics. Sparing a popular fighter is a sign of magnanimity, winning favor with the public. But refusing the mob's demand for blood can be politically disastrous, a display of weakness or stinginess. The imperial decision is almost always made to maximize political capital, not out of any sudden surge of humanity. If the judgment is mit, the victor assists his opponent off the sand, where he is immediately rushed back into the tunnels for the intensive, expensive care provided by the Lucas surgeons. The price of his survival is often severe. He must carry the shame of the defeat, the physical scars, and the moral debt of the mercy granted. But if the judgment is Ugula, the final, agonizing ritual begins. The victorious gladiator steps forward. He is obliged to carry out the execution professionally and cleanly. The fallen man is often expected to remain stoic and motionless, accepting the inevitable without supplication or complaint. This last act of dignitas dying well was the final, solitary triumph a gladiator could claim. The victor would use his short sword, gladius or seeker, to deliver a quick, clean stroke into the neck, ensuring rapid, efficient death. This final, fatal moment completed the dehumanization process begun in the ludus. The brave, strong man who had just provided immense entertainment was instantly reduced to a piece of refuse. His blood, the final payment for his life, seeped into the thirsty sand. The victor, still standing, then raised his arms to receive the tumultuous, renewed applause of the crowd, now sated by the final act of destruction. He had won a temporary reprieve, and perhaps a small crown or palm branch, the tangible, fleeting reward for taking a life that was both comrade and adversary. The tragedy of the pollis verso lies in its cold utility. It was the ultimate moment where human life was transformed into a simple binary vote, entertainment or elimination, controlled by the indifferent whim of the state and the insatiable thirst of the Roman collective. The death was not a consequence of war or justice. It was a scheduled conclusion to a theatrical contract. The final stroke has been delivered. The crowd has roared its satisfaction, and the victor has been led away for a brief moment of praise and a necessary check of his own wounds. The dust settles, but the spectacle is far from over. The dead cannot simply lie there, for the flow of entertainment must be ceaseless and immediate. Now commences the most ignoble and chilling part of the process, the disposal of the body. The man who moments ago embodied the virtues of Rome, who was cheered and admired, is now nothing but a cooling obstruction on the meticulously raked sand. The arena must be reset quickly, and for this grim task, specialized functionaries appear. These men, belonging to the lowest social class, are clad in costumes designed to add a final, macabre flourish to the tragedy. One might be dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead from Greek mythology, and another as Mercury, the swift messenger of the gods who escorted souls to the underworld. The symbolism is clear. The fighter has completed his journey, and his soul is now officially departing. The Mercury figure often approaches the body first, carrying a white-hot iron rod to brand the flesh, a final, cruel confirmation of death, though by this point, the lack of movement makes the verification painfully obvious. The Charon figure, sometimes carrying a large mallet, would then deliver a final, ceremonial blow to the skull, an absurd and unnecessary act that completes the theatrical transition from warrior to corpse. This ritual served no practical purpose other than to underscore the utter worthlessness of the man in his post-mortem state. Even in death, the gladiator remained a character in Rome's relentless, bloody play. A heavy iron hook is brought forth. The body, stripped of its valuable armor and weapons, which are immediately collected and cleaned for the next fight or the next season, is roughly secured. The body is then unceremoniously dragged across the sand, leaving a dark, serpentine track of blood and dust, heading directly towards the Porta Libertinensis, the Gate of Death. The name itself is derived from Libitina, the ancient goddess associated with funerals, and this gate was reserved only for the dead. It was the absolute point of no return. As the body is dragged away, the arena crew descends upon the specific patch of sand. They work with practiced, brutal efficiency. The blood-soaked sand is swiftly shoveled away and carted off, immediately replaced with fresh, clean sand, often brought in from local riverbeds, ensuring that the next pair of fighters finds a pristine, untainted stage upon which to perform their own fate. This quick sanitization process spoke volumes. Death was considered pollution, a temporary stain that had to be erased instantly so that the spectacle could maintain its illusion of endless, clean excitement. The life of the fallen man was a messy event that could not be allowed to interrupt the schedule. Once through the Porta Libertinensis, the body's final indignities are completed. The dead gladiator is taken to a communal burial pit or charnel house, often located just outside the city walls. Unless the fighter was a superstar like Flamma or Spartacus, his body received no form of funeral rites, no burning pyre, and no proper grave marker. They were simply dumped together, the bodies of the Thracian, the Gaul, the Roman Aucteratus lying in an undifferentiated heap. They were deemed to have died the mors turpissima, the most shameful death of fate that precluded the honours afforded to ordinary Roman dead. However, the lanista retained the right to the corpse. If the gladiator was particularly famous, a valuable asset even in death, his bones might be retrieved and his remains used for anatomical study, or simply to confirm the death to the investing patrons. More often, the lanista, seeking to monetize the fighter's fame one last time, might erect a simple epitaph, a small stone marker, placed not on a grave, but perhaps in the ludus or the lanista's own property. These epitaphs often list the man's stage name, his class, the number of times he fought, and the number of victories he achieved. Here lies Marcus, Threx, fought 14 times, died in the 15th. These inscriptions, stark and purely numerical, are the only enduring record of their fleeting, tragic existence. They measure a life not in years or accomplishments, but solely in professional engagements with death. The tragedy of the gladiator extends even beyond the grave. He remains defined only by his service, his ultimate destination a shared ditch, his only monument a simple, brutal calculation of his statistical life. The silence that greets his passing outside the arena is total and permanent, a harsh contrast to the roar that accompanied his last, mortal breath. The gladiator's existence was defined by a contradiction so stark it fractured the very foundation of Roman social order. On one hand, he was subject to the most severe legal contempt. By the very act of entering the arena, he incurred the status of infamous, a person stripped of all legal rights and social standing. He could not vote, he could not hold public office, he could not act as a legal witness, and his contract with the Lanista rendered him, in legal terms, little better than a convicted criminal. His body was property, his soul was publicly shamed, and his status was below that of the most common and skilled slave. He was a symbol of disgrace. Yet, on the other hand, the successful gladiator, the one who survived multiple bouts, who was granted missio mercy repeatedly, ascended to an astronomical level of superstardom. His fame transcended Rome itself, reaching the furthest provinces of the empire. His name, a professional designation, Plumber the Secutor, Spiculus the Murmillo, or Crescens the Retiarius, was uttered with a mixture of awe and obsession. They were the most celebrated, most talked about figures in the entire Roman world, possessing a magnetic power that mocked the legal shackles of their low status. This bizarre duality was most intensely felt by Roman women, particularly those of the highest social ranks. The gladiator represented the antithesis of the staid, moralistic, and often dull life of the Roman patrician. He was danger personified, a master of violence who lived constantly on the knife edge of death. This potent, volatile combination of high-risk survival and raw, muscular spectacle made them irresistible. Graffiti, scrawled on walls across the empire, particularly in Pompeii, serves as a testament to this obsession. These hastily scratched declarations read like the frenzied outbursts of modern fandom. Celadis, the Thracian, is the delight of all the girls, or Crescens, the Retiarius, is the net of the girls' hearts. Women even wore tiny amulets bearing the gladiator's image, a practice viewed with scandalized horror by conservative moralists like Juvenal, who deplored the erosion of traditional Roman modesty. This immense, public adoration provided a potent, corrupting temptation for the free-born Roman citizen who became an auctoratus, facing financial ruin, political disgrace, or simply a profound existential emptiness. They often chose the arena not for the money, though prizes could be substantial, but for the sudden, burning flash of meaning. For a man who felt invisible in the complex hierarchy of Roman politics, the deafening roar of the Colosseum offering him recognition was a powerful, if ultimately fatal, substitute for true dignity. They exchanged a life of silence, civil misery for a short, loud life of spectacular risk. The financial rewards were real, though always controlled by the Lanista. Successful fighters received lavish gifts, prize money, premia, and endorsements. Their earnings could be staggering, allowing them to purchase valuable jewelry or, if they were truly lucky, eventually buy their freedom, the rudes. But even wealth and the wooden sword of freedom did not entirely erase the infamia. A freed gladiator, a Rudiarius, remained forever tainted. He might become a wealthy trainer in the ludus, a paid bodyguard, or even a celebrated guest at banquets, but he could never truly reclaim his civil rights. The sand, once stepped upon, left a permanent stain on the soul and the status of the man. The inherent paradox was a source of endless social fascination and moral panic. The gladiator was the ultimate embodiment of Roman virtues, courage, endurance, and skill in combat, but this valor was deployed for entertainment, not for the state. He was the perfect physical hero, yet the most imperfect social citizen. This contradiction perfectly mirrored Rome's own increasingly decadent state, an empire that obsessed over law and order, yet found its greatest pleasure in the spectacular, lawless destruction of human life. The gladiator was therefore just an entertainer. He was a living, breathing symbol of the moral crisis at the heart of the imperial age, a glamorous outcast whose every breath was a silent reproach to the society that adored and despised him in equal measure. His fame was a magnificent, glittering trap. The gladiator's existence was defined by a contradiction so stark it fractured the very foundation of Roman social order. On one hand, He was subject to the most severe legal contempt. By the very act of entering the arena, he incurred the status of infamous, a person stripped of all legal rights and social standing. He could not vote, he could not hold public office, he could not act as a legal witness, and his contract with the Lannister rendered him, in legal terms, little better than a convicted criminal. His body was property, his soul was publicly shamed, and his status was below that of the most common and skilled slave. He was a symbol of disgrace. Yet, on the other hand, the successful gladiator, the one who survived multiple bouts, who was granted missio mercy repeatedly, ascended to an astronomical level of superstardom. His fame transcended Rome itself, reaching the furthest provinces of the empire. His name, a professional designation, Plumber the Secutor, Spiculus the Murmillo, or Crescens the Retiarius, was uttered with a mixture of awe and obsession. They were the most celebrated, most talked about figures in the entire Roman world, possessing a magnetic power that mocked the legal shackles of their low status. This bizarre duality was most intensely felt by Roman women, particularly those of the highest social ranks. The gladiator represented the antithesis of the staid, moralistic, and often dull life of the Roman patrician. He was danger personified, a master of violence who lived constantly on the knife edge of death. This potent, volatile combination of high-risk survival and raw, muscular spectacle made them irresistible. Graffiti, scrawled on walls across the empire, particularly in Pompeii, serves as a testament to this obsession. These hastily scratched declarations read like the frenzied outbursts of modern fandom. Celadis, the Thracian, is the delight of all the girls, or Crescens, the Retiarius, is the net of the girls' hearts. Women even wore tiny amulets bearing the gladiator's image, a practice viewed with scandalized horror by conservative moralists like Juvenal, who deplored the erosion of traditional Roman modesty. This immense, public adoration provided a potent, corrupting temptation for the free-born Roman citizen who became an auctoratus, facing financial ruin, political disgrace, or simply a profound existential emptiness. They often chose the arena not for the money, though prizes could be substantial, but for the sudden, burning flash of meaning. For a man who felt invisible in the complex hierarchy of Roman politics, the deafening roar of the Colosseum offering him recognition was a powerful, if ultimately fatal, substitute for true dignity. They exchanged a life of silence, civil misery for a short, loud life of spectacular risk. The financial rewards were real, though always controlled by the Lannister. Successful fighters received lavish gifts, prize money, premia, and endorsements. Their earnings could be staggering, allowing them to purchase valuable jewelry or, if they were truly lucky, eventually buy their freedom, the rudies. But even wealth and the wooden sword of freedom did not entirely erase the infamia. A freed gladiator, a Rutiarius, remained forever tainted. He might become a wealthy trainer in the Ludus, a paid bodyguard, or even a celebrated guest at banquets, but he could never truly reclaim his civil rights. The sand, once stepped upon, left a permanent stain on the soul and the status of the man. The inherent paradox was a source of endless social fascination and moral panic. The gladiator was the ultimate embodiment of Roman virtues, courage, endurance, and skill in combat, but this valor was deployed for entertainment, not for the state. He was the perfect physical hero, yet the most imperfect social citizen. This contradiction perfectly mirrored Rome's own increasingly decadent state, an empire that obsessed over law and order, yet found its greatest pleasure in the spectacular, lawless destruction of human life. The gladiator was therefore just an entertainer. He was a living, breathing symbol of the moral crisis at the heart of the imperial age, a glamorous outcast whose every breath was a silent reproach to the society that adored and despised him in equal measure. His fame was a magnificent, glittering trap. The profound tragedy of the gladiator's life, steeped in the shame of infamia and the certainty of violence, was not solely a male experience. Within the complex, bloody machinery of the Ludi, there existed a rare, highly sensationalized, and deeply scandalous phenomenon, the gladiatrix, or female gladiator. Their very presence on the sand represented the most extreme violation of traditional Roman social norms, serving as a powerful, unsettling spice in the vast stew of imperial entertainment. Roman society meticulously defined the role of the woman. She was to be chaste, veiled, centered on the household domus, and strictly removed from the rough, public spheres of politics and warfare. The woman who willingly stepped onto the arena, the ultimate expression of the male, martial world, committed an act of total social apostasy. She forfeited not just her legal rights, but every ounce of dignity associated with her gender, transforming herself into an exotic curiosity. These female fighters were exceedingly rare, often appearing during the grandest festivals sponsored by the wealthiest patrons or the most ostentatious emperors who wished to prove their novelty and generosity. Their scarcity only heightened their drawing power. They were often matched against each other in highly specific, unusual pairings, sometimes fighting without helmets, or even stripped to the waist, to ensure the audience was constantly reminded of the radical transgression of their gender. The goal was to shock, titillate, and incite scandalized fascination. Historical records confirm their existence. During the reign of Nero, the famed historian Tacitus noted that even noble women and senators' wives descended into the arena, an act of decadence he wrote of with utter disgust. Emperor Domitian, always keen on spectacle, hosted events featuring female gladiators fighting by torchlight, an exotic, midnight show designed to appeal to the lowest impulses of the crowd. Perhaps the most tangible evidence of their reality is the marble relief discovered in Halicarnassus, dating back to the 1st or 2nd century CE. This striking piece of sculpture depicts two robustly built female fighters, identifiable by their names inscribed below Amazonia and Aquileia. They are shown in mid-combat, wearing only loincloths, armed with shields, daggers, and greaves. Crucially, the inscription beneath them notes that they were granted missio, they fought to an honorable draw and were spared. This suggests that even these highly unusual contests were governed by the same professional rules and considerations of bravery virtues as the men's bouts. The gladiatrix rarely, if ever, came from the typical ranks of foreign captives. They were often slaves purchased specifically for this purpose, women with powerful builds who were forced into the training. However, some were almost certainly outre free women who chose the arena due to desperation, or, perhaps, a fierce, reckless craving for fame and notoriety unattainable elsewhere in the rigid Roman social structure. Their decision was a profound statement of personal ruin, exchanging the invisibility of poverty for the intense, brief visibility of the spectacle. The backlash from the moral guardians of the empire was fierce and immediate. The sight of women wielding weapons and engaging in male violence was seen as a sign of societal decay and dangerous gender fluidity. This moral panic eventually led Emperor Septimius Severus to issue a permanent ban on female participation in gladiatorial combat around 200 CE. His edict acknowledged that the practice, though popular, fundamentally undermined the idealized virtue of the Roman woman. This legislative act effectively ended the public spectacle of the gladiatrix, confirming that their existence was always considered an anomaly, a breach of sacred custom indulged only for the sake of exceptional, scandalous entertainment. The ultimate tragedy of the gladiatrix was that her bravery on the sand earned her no true respect. She was not honored as a warrior. She was consumed as a sensational novelty. Her fight was not for a civil future, but for a moment of prurient, fleeting attention, confirming her status as the most socially damned individual in the empire, a woman who sold not only her life, but her very societal soul for the roar of the Roman crowd. The system of gladiator training, the relentless cycle of ludus discipline and arena slaughter, rested upon the absolute suppression of the individual will. It was a massive, fragile machine built on the premise that the man in chains would never possess the collective strength to break free. Yet, there was one moment in Roman history where that machine catastrophically failed, a moment that caused the Senate and the entire Roman elite to tremble. the Third Servile War, known universally as the Revolt of Spartacus. The uprising began not as a grand political movement, but as a spontaneous, desperate break for survival. It started in 73 BCE, within the high walls of the gladiatorial school, the Ludus in Capua. The key figure was Spartacus, a Thracian cavalry auxiliary turned gladiator, who, alongside a small group of around 70 fellow fighters, mostly Gauls and Thracians, broke out. Their initial success was almost comical in its simplicity. They seized cooking implements, spits, knives, and cleavers before securing proper weapons from a passing wagon of gladiatorial gear. They fled, taking refuge on the slopes of nearby Mount Vesuvius. The Roman authorities, accustomed to sporadic, disorganized slave revolts, initially dismissed this as nothing more than an inconvenient police action. They sent inadequate, often poorly trained local militias, viewing the gladiators as merely infames who would be easily rounded up. This gross underestimation was the empire's first fatal mistake. The gladiators, trained to kill with deadly precision, disciplined by years of brutal routine, and possessing a collective rage unique to the condemned, decimated the Roman forces sent against them. The initial victories at Vesuvius and later against proper military commanders provided the spark that ignited the deep, simmering resentment across southern Italy. The Spartacus revolt quickly swelled far beyond its gladiatorial core. Thousands of rural slaves, poor freemen, shepherds, and landless peasants, all victims of Rome's rapacious system, flocked to the gladiators' banner. At its peak, the army of Spartacus may have numbered over 120,000 men, women, and children. It was a massive, diverse, and inherently chaotic movement. The fundamental tragedy of Spartacus was his clarity of purpose against the ambivalence of his followers. Spartacus did not seek to conquer Rome or usurp the power of the emperors. He aimed for the simplest, most profound goal imaginable: freedom. His strategic objective was to lead his people north, across the frozen passes of the Alps, and back to their respective homelands in Gaul, Thrace, and Germania. His army's relentless 2-year march across the length and breadth of Italy from Campania south to Lucania, and then north again, was a desperate effort to escape the Roman world entirely. However, the vast majority of his followers, especially the Gauls led by Crixus, did not share this vision of retreat. They wanted vengeance, plunder, and the immediate spoils of war within Italy. This constant internal strife, the clash between Spartacus's disciplined, strategic vision and the anarchic, vengeful desires of his disparate army, doomed the entire enterprise. Crixus and the large detachment broke away, only to be crushed by the Roman legions. Rome, finally recognizing the existential threat, placed the formidable resources of the Republic under the control of Marcus Licinius Crassus, a brilliant general and immensely wealthy man. Crassus cornered the slave army in Lucania. In the final, decisive confrontation in 71 BCE, the gladiatorial army was utterly defeated. Spartacus, refusing the chance to flee, rushed into the thickest part of the fray, fighting with the savage courage of a man who knew his cause was lost, but his dignity was not. He was reportedly cut down. His body never positively identified a grim, appropriate end for a man who had already shed his name and identity for the arena. The aftermath was a deliberate, brutal spectacle of imperial terror. Crassus, determined to send an unmistakable message to every slave and restless citizen in Italy, captured 6,000 of the surviving rebels. He ordered their crucifixion along the entire length of the Appian Way, the great road connecting Capua, the starting point of the revolt, to Rome. 4 miles, the road was lined with the silent, rotting corpses of the condemned, a horrifying monument to Roman power and the savage price of daring to dream of freedom. The tragedy of Spartacus was not just his death, but the collective, bloody erasure of the one true uprising against the system of the Ludi. The lesson was learned. The cost of escaping the arena was total annihilation. After the initial, daring escape from the Ludus in Capua and their entrenchment on the volcanic slopes of Mount Vesuvius, the movement of the gladiators and slaves swiftly transcended a mere riot. It became an army, albeit a raw and constantly changing one. The earliest clashes with Roman praetors, such as Gaius Claudius Glaber, not only proved the rebels' combat readiness, but established the terrifying myth of Spartacus's invincibility. Glaber, leading 3,000 militia troops, successfully blocked the single, known descent path from Vesuvius. The Romans confidently anticipated that starvation and thirst would compel the gladiators to surrender. It was precisely at this moment that Spartacus's tactical genius, honed by years of ruthless training, ironically under Roman supervision, came to the fore. His men, masters of physical endurance and improvisation, harvested the abundant wild vines clinging to the mountainside. They wove these into strong, supple ropes and ladders, allowing them to rappel silently down the sheer, unguarded cliff faces of the volcano's caldera. Bypassing the Roman sentries entirely, they executed a devastating surprise attack on Glaber's exposed camp at dawn, a time when Roman military discipline was often at its lowest ebb. The Roman militia, caught completely unaware, were routed, their equipment seized. This was more than a victory. It was a psychological humiliation for Rome, proof that the very tools of Roman spectacle, the gladiators, could dismantle Roman military power. The army of Spartacus grew exponentially in the fertile, slave-dependent lands of Campania and Lucania. Thousands of rural and domestic slaves, desperate for any chance at liberation, flocked to the banner. The gladiators, still the core and the most effective fighting unit, provided the essential military expertise, transforming the disorganized rabble into mobile, effective legions capable of employing cavalry, infantry, and siege tactics. They manufactured their own weapons and armor, utilizing captured Roman gear and fashioning implements from raw materials in the field, displaying an engineering prowess born of necessity. The profound tragedy of the revolt lay in its divided purpose. Spartacus, the Thracian auxiliary, appeared to remain steadfastly committed to his initial, most pragmatic goal: absolute flight from Italy. His strategic mind dictated a march north toward the Alps, aiming to dissolve the army and return every man to his respective homeland, Thrace, Gaul, Germania, before Rome could muster its main consular legions. However, the vast majority of his followers, particularly the large Gallic and Germanic contingents led by the ambitious Crixus, did not share this vision of immediate retreat. They were fueled by a deep thirst for vengeance against the masters who had tortured them and the desire for the immediate spoils of war within the Italian heartland. This constant, debilitating internal division, the clash between Spartacus's strategic, disciplined escape and the anarchic, vengeful desires of his subordinates, was the inherent flaw that doomed the enterprise. In 70 BCE, Crixus and a large, independent detachment broke away, choosing to remain in southern Italy. They were swiftly intercepted and crushed by a Roman consular army, proving Spartacus correct but weakening his main force irreparably. Spartacus, after leading his main army to the very foot of the Alps, achieved his strategic objective. Yet, his followers, tasting continued victory and influenced by the allure of plunder, refused to cross the passes into freedom, forcing a desperate return south. This turn away from safety and back into the belly of the beast marked the final, fatal phase of the revolt. The gladiators were excellent fighters, but against the combined might of Rome's full legions, directed by a single, ruthless commander like Marcus Licinius Crassus, their ultimate defeat was a matter of grim inevitability. They had won countless battles, humiliating Rome repeatedly, but they could not win the war against the fundamental, crushing economic and military superiority of the empire they sought to abandon. The failure of the rebel army to seize the moment and cross the Alps in 70 BCE sealed their collective fate. That desperate decision to turn back into the heartland of the enemy was fueled by the intoxication of plunder and the deep, anarchic impulses of the non-gladiatorial majority. This refusal extinguished Spartacus's last, best chance for a strategic victory and initiated the final, most brutal chapter of the war, for Rome had finally ceased viewing the revolt as a mere internal disturbance. The Senate recognized the threat for what it was, an existential crisis demanding a response commensurate with the city's military might. The task of annihilation was entrusted to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose ambition was matched only by his staggering wealth and ruthless pragmatism. Crassus was no ordinary general. He was a political force capable of financing and commanding an army of up to 10 full legions, an unprecedented concentration of military power. He understood that the problem was not merely tactical. It was one of morale and absolute control. Crassus immediately imposed a regime of iron discipline of his own forces, reviving the ancient and terrifying punishment of decimation, the execution of 1 in every 10 men in a cowardly unit, to restore the fear of the general that had been lost after the previous defeats by Spartacus. This act was crucial. He ensured his Roman soldiers feared him more than they feared the gladiators. Spartacus, now leading an army that was essentially trapped and dissolving, retreated south into the toe of the Italian peninsula, Bruttium, modern Calabria. His desperate aim was to secure passage across the Strait of Messina to Sicily, a vast island ripe with slave populations that could swell his ranks and provide a defensible new base. However, Crassus was relentless. He did not rush into battle, recognizing that Spartacus's genius thrived on swift, opportunistic maneuvers. Instead, Crassus implemented a strategic campaign of containment, utilizing his superior resources to build a vast defensive wall and ditch stretching across the narrowest point of Bruttium, spanning the entire peninsula from sea to sea. This massive engineering feat, a fortification 55 kilometers long, 3 meters deep, and 3 meters wide, was a humiliating maneuver for the rebels. It transformed their open campaign into a siege. The wall effectively cut off Spartacus's army from the rest of Italy, confining them to the cold, barren toe of Bruttium during the harsh winter of 72-71 BCE, subjecting them to starvation and demoralization. The gladiators, once the masters of the open road, were now prisoners of Roman logistical superiority. In the face of starvation, Spartacus attempted his final, grand tactical stroke. Under the cover of a fierce blizzard, the rebels managed to fill sections of the ditch with earth, brushwood, and the bodies of their own animals and fallen comrades, creating rough bridges. In a brilliant feat of nocturnal military engineering, they executed a breakout, escaping the trap with immense difficulty and heavy losses. Crassus, infuriated by the breach but recognizing the inherent chaos of the escape, did not pursue immediately. He knew the rebels, though free of the trap, were now fragmented and weak. The ultimate end came swiftly. Spartacus's army, no longer a cohesive force, but a collection of desperate bands, moved north, attempting to make one last dash toward the port of Brundisium. The fatal flaw or internal discord reasserted itself. A large contingent of Gauls and Germans, breaking away again under the command of 2 lieutenants, were intercepted by Crassus and crushed in the mountainous regions of Lucania. This final, major loss severely weakened the main body of the gladiatorial force. Crassus cornered the remaining army, commanded by Spartacus himself, near the headwaters of the river Silarus. The final battle in 71 BCE was not a tactical masterpiece, but a sheer act of desperate courage against overwhelming military might. Spartacus, knowing this was the end, reportedly killed his own horse before the battle, symbolizing his determination to conquer or die with his men. He would share their fate, not escape it. He charged directly into the heart of the Roman lines, aiming for Crassus himself. He managed to cut down to Roman centurions before his small, devoted guard was surrounded and utterly overwhelmed. Historical accounts agree that Spartacus was seen fighting bravely until the very end, but his body was never recovered, an appropriate, defiant disappearance for the mythic figure. The immediate aftermath was one of total, unforgiving annihilation. Crassus ensured that no fewer than 6,000 of the captured rebels were selected for the ultimate display of Roman authority. They were not merely executed, they were crucified along the entire length of the Appian Way, the major highway running from Capua where the revolt began all the way to the gates of Rome. For over 200 kilometers, the road was lined with the gruesome silent testimony of the crucified, the decaying bodies serving as a grotesque, towering reminder to every traveler, every citizen, and every slave. This is the absolute uncompromising price of attempting to dismantle the Pax Romana. This deliberate, extended spectacle was the ultimate act of infamia, ensuring the rebels were denied not only life, but even the dignity of a swift death or a proper burial. The entire revolt, led by the trained fighters of the arena, served as a profound, terrible confirmation of Rome's true nature. The gladiators had proven they were the most terrifyingly effective soldiers in the empire, capable of defeating consular armies and challenging the Republic's very stability. But they could not defeat the system of power that created them. The tragic dream of freedom born in the cold walls of a gladiatorial school was finally brutally and publicly extinguished, confirming that the ultimate Roman spectacle was not the death of one man on the arena sand, but the mass crucifixion of thousands along its proudest public road. The age of the gladiatorial army was over. The age of the professional killer for entertainment had been brutally reaffirmed. Amidst the constant cycle of violence, humiliation, and eventual annihilation that defined the gladiatorial existence, there existed one faint, almost impossible beacon of hope, the granting of the Rudis the wooden sword. This was the ceremonial object, the ultimate prize, signifying the gladiator's freedom manumissio and his official retirement from the sand. It was the moment the sacramentum, the vow of death, was formally annulled. The Rudis itself was the very instrument used in the gladiator's early, brutal training against the palace. To receive the wooden sword was a profound irony. It marked the end of his life as a professional killer and the beginning of a life free of the imminent threat of death. Yet he was left with the training tool of his servitude. A gladiator did not receive this token through a simple purchase or the end of a fixed contract. It had to be earned through years of consistent bravery, spectacle, and a long record of survival, making him too valuable or too revered by the public to risk losing. The Lannister would only grant it when the profits from the gladiator's continued fighting no longer justified the high risk of his death. For the man who finally received the Rudis, the moment was one of staggering, complex emotion. He was free, yet the freedom was profoundly compromised. He remained forever marked by the infamy, the deep, indelible social stain of having been a gladiator. He was, legally, a freedman libertus, and while he could own property and conduct business, he could never fully reclaim the status of a free-born Roman citizen. He was now a rudiarius, a designation that forever identified his past profession, and in the polite society of Rome, he remained an outcast adored from a distance in the amphitheatre, but shunned in the Senate and the Forum. The life of a rudiarius was often characterized by a different kind of pain than the one experienced on the sand. The physical toll of the career was immense and permanent. Years of fighting left them with chronic injuries, grinding arthritis, unyielding joint pain, deep, debilitating scars, and neurological damage from repeated blows to the head. The advanced medical care in the Ludis ensured they survived, but it could not erase the wreckage left behind. The freed gladiator carried his battlefield on his body, a walking map of past agonies. Many freed gladiators found themselves returning to the only life they truly knew. The most common career path was becoming an assistant trainer or doctor within the very Ludis that had enslaved them. Here, the former fighter could leverage his expertise and fame to train the next generation of doomed fighters, providing a stable, profitable income while remaining within the familiar, if cold, structure of the gladiator school. Other successful rudiri became bodyguards for wealthy patricians, where their skill, reputation for ruthlessness, and sheer intimidation factor commanded high fees. The deepest, most insidious tragedy lay in the psychological return to peace. The arena offered an intense, binary clarity, life or death, skill or failure. The deafening roar of the crowd provided a terrifying, yet undeniable, sense of purpose and self-worth, a feeling of being intensely alive. Civilian life, with its quiet compromises, its bureaucratic frustrations, and its anonymity, often felt pallid and meaningless by comparison. Some rudary, unable to cope with the slow delay of peacetime, actually signed new contracts with the Lannistra rare phenomenon that baffled Roman society. They returned to the sand, sometimes demanding enormous sums, because only in the proximity of imminent, violent death could they feel truly whole. The arena was not just a stage for them. It was an addiction to adrenaline and existential validation. The rudies, therefore, was not a simple key to freedom. It was a transition into a different, equally complex form of exile. It was the prize that proved a man could survive the slaughter, but it could never truly free him from the memory, the scars, or the profound social contamination of his glorious, tragic past. His freedom was a solitary, expensive quietude, always overshadowed by the echo of the crowds he had served. The tumultuous history of the gladiator, encompassing the harsh discipline of the ludus, the dazzling terror of the arena, and the brief, failed dream of revolt, all dissolved eventually into silence. When the imperial funding dried up, when the popular fervor finally waned, and when the Christianized states began to view the sheer scale of the bloodletting as an anachronism, the games came to a quiet, final end. But the men themselves, those individuals who had lived and died by the sword, left behind an unusual, often heartbreaking legacy, etched not in historical scrolls written by senators, but in the most transient and permanent of media, graffiti and stone. The most intimate record of the gladiator's fleeting fame is found upon the walls of ancient towns like Pompeii and Herculaneum. These graffiti were the public's immediate, unfiltered opinion, the viral posts of the ancient world. They are filled with boastful claims, Atticus is victorious, or the highly sexualized adoration, Nika is a champion and the darling of the girls of the house. These hasty scribbles humanize the fighter, pulling him momentarily out of the anonymous mass of the infamous and elevating him to the status of a local, flesh and blood hero, pursued by women and admired by boys. The graffiti capture the moment of his greatest social power, a power utterly divorced from his lack of legal rights. Yet, a far more somber legacy rests in the epitaphs, the grave markers left by Lannister, patrons, or the few family members who survived the freedmen. These inscriptions, found in cemeteries dedicated to the collegium or in private family plots, are starkly honest accounting of a life lived under sentence of death. They rarely contain the flowery praise afforded to generals or magistrates. Instead, they provide a professional ledger, listing the man's stage name, his armatura, class of fighter, the number of times he fought, and the number of times he was granted missio reprieve. Consider the preserved stone of Flamma, the Syrian Secutor, one of the most celebrated and resilient fighters known from Roman history. His epitaph records that he fought 34 times and won 21 victories, an astonishing rate of survival. It notes that he was offered the rudies and freedom for separate times, yet he repeatedly refused it, choosing instead to re-sign his Auctoratus contract to fight again, confirming that for some, the high-stakes chaos of the arena had become the only meaningful life. Flamma was eventually killed at age 30, a truly venerable age for a man in his profession. His stone is not a celebration of peace, but a permanent record of his relentless confrontation with death. The overwhelming tragedy captured by these stones is the replacement of the human identity with the professional identity. The gladiator's existence was measured not by his years as a son, a husband, or a worker, but solely by his engagements on the sand. His ultimate value was a numerical tally. Even the sentiment found on these stones is often framed by fatalism, a bitter acceptance of the hand fate dealt. One epitaph reads, I advise you to flee the deadly allure of the arena. Whoever does not, finds the fate of Sextus. Another, more mournful note. Here lies Eutyches, who lived 25 years. He fought 11 times. He was killed by the treachery of his opponent. The enduring purpose of the gladiator in the Roman consciousness was not his physical strength, but his function as a symbol of absolute obedience and courage. He embodied the idea that Rome's subjects would face death with dignity and discipline, even when that death was orchestrated purely for the entertainment of their masters. In his perfect, stylized death, the gladiator performed the highest service to the state. He demonstrated that Roman power was absolute, and that Roman justice was mercilessly final. The great stone amphitheaters remain, their ruins slowly crumbling back into the earth, but the sand has long been replaced by tourist paths and archaeological trenches. Yet, if one closes their eyes, amidst the silence of the massive ruins, it is possible to hear the faintest echo of that original soundscape. It is not the roar of the crowd, nor the clash of metal, but the quiet, deep sound of a man taking a ragged breath, the single human sound that precedes the final, fatal stroke. The gladiator's tragic, short life was a temporary sacrifice, a blazing spectacle of human defiance and humiliation offered up for the enjoyment of the empire. And for those few moments, standing alone on the blood-soaked arena, they were the most alive and the most utterly condemned men in the world.